distinguished friends, Vice President JD Vance and Senator Banks, we are informed that the Vice President is in traffic, and so after consulting to my right and left, we will proceed again because there are time constraints. And when the Vice President arrives, I think he'll be arriving just in time. So proceeding on, if confirmed, Mr. Colby would oversee the developments of policy and strategy for the Department of Defense. He would assume these responsibilities during the most dangerous security environment since World War II. The deepening military cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea represents a complex and far-reaching set of threats. These threats demand a generational investment to revitalize America's military strength. They demand rapid Pentagon reform, and they demand a fresh look at strategies needed to achieve our national security objectives. The American people need to understand what is at stake. We should help the country appreciate the risks imposed to our way of life. Beijing is leading an emerging alliance of countries with one clear objective: to use their economic and military power to tear down the United States and impose their will on global affairs. The new axis of aggressors is a greater menace than we have faced in decades. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the Chinese Communist Party has undertaken one of the largest and most aggressive military buildups in history. Their speed has been astounding. In just a few short years, China has built more nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles than the U.S. has in decades. They have tested orbital bombardment weapons and unveiled what may be the world's first sixth-generation fighter aircraft. China possesses a shipbuilding capacity over 230 times that of the United States. Over 230 times. That's almost inconceivable. Over 3 years ago, Vladimir Putin launched the first invasion of a European country since World War II. He has barraged the Ukrainian people with constant missile and drone attacks. The Kremlin has developed a variety of new weapons capabilities, including nuclear-armed satellites. Meanwhile, Russia actively provides enriched uranium to China to support Beijing's nuclear buildup. Putin has also been suspected of aiding North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Moving on to North Korea, the nuclear arsenal there continues to advance unchecked. Kim Jong-un has been aiding Russia's war machine as it terrorizes Europe. Pyongyang's missiles could soon be capable of overwhelming our defenses, North Korea's, especially if reports of Russian assistance are accurate. In the Middle East, Israel has successfully crippled Iran's proxies in the region, but these setbacks may spur Tehran to take the final step to build a nuclear weapon, permanently altering the balance of power in that region. Few really understand how this axis of aggressors is working to make Americans less safe. If confirmed, I hope Mr. Colby can help Secretary Hegseth as he makes sure the public sees these threats for what they are. During Secretary Hegseth's hearing, I spoke about the importance of building a motivated and highly competent team of professionals at the Pentagon. In this regard, Mr. Colby is certainly qualified for the role to which President Trump has nominated him. For more than 2 decades, he has worked on defense policy. Mr. Colby previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that role, Mr. Colby played a pivotal role in the formulation of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the first real strategy in years. His leadership was crucial in helping the United States articulate the need for a new defense posture, one focused on strategic competition with China and Russia and the overdue modernization of our military. Mr. Colby and I have been ringing the same bell on military unpreparedness for years, particularly as it relates to China. This committee would echo exhortations on defense policy in the Western Pacific. We should make Taiwan a porcupine, and Taipei is sprinting in that direction. We should build a larger U.S. military footprint in East Asia, and we should accelerate the most important weapons programs to deter China. President Trump has made it clear that he intends to rebuild the military and reform the Pentagon. He campaigned on peace through strength. We all want to keep America safe and prosperous. To secure that peace will enable a golden age for America. But we do not now have the strength that can guarantee us the peace. Given the threat environment facing us, I strongly believe that we cannot simply pivot our attention and resources from one threat to another. That is an approach the Obama administration tried, and it did fail. We must be focused and strategic. But we need to be clear. Beijing sees its fight against America as a global fight. Beijing is not pivoting between theaters or among theaters. Significant American withdrawal in Europe, Africa, South America, or the Middle East will allow the Chinese Communist Party to overcome us strategically, even if we are able to prevent military conflict in East Asia in the near term. In the past few weeks, President Trump has killed 5 top Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists. Good for him. He's greenlit more aggressive campaign against the Houthis and promised to support Israel to the hilt. All these policies are in line with the president's desire for lasting peace and prosperity in the United States. And Mr. Colby, I'm sure that is your desire too. Now, Mr. Colby, your views on each theater have seemingly evolved since 2018, and I'm sure there'll be discussions about that are worth exploring. It goes without saying that the elephant in this hearing room today is the recent developments with regard to Ukraine and Russia and this administration. I was disappointed and dismayed as I watched the televised meeting involving the President of the United States and President Zelensky. And I was distressed that the White House meeting ended without the signing of the minerals agreement, which was there to be signed, as I understand it. This was followed by a television appearance by President Zelensky, and then a visit to some of our friends in Europe, where there's much concern about the failure of that agreement to be signed. It was also followed that weekend by Mr. Putin's continued barrage of attacking apartments, civilian targets, and other areas in Ukraine. Not a good weekend for peace in Ukraine or world peace. The president's trying to get a peace deal in Ukraine, and I certainly hope we'll be able to get this back on the rails. I would like to hear your views on the potential there. Your views on President Trump's crystal clear Iran policy seem to have hardened considerably. Yet your views on Taiwan's importance to the United States seems to have softened considerably. I hope we can clarify those views today. And your views on the relevance of nuclear weapons in the next decade remain unclear to me. I would appreciate your comments on each of those issues. Mr. Colby, you've spoken frequently to audiences who are skeptical of the idea that U.S. peace and prosperity require us to wield U.S. power abroad. I'm grateful that you have led those discussions that U.S. foreign policy professionals do not like having. I expect your points on the limits of U.S. power remain nuanced and complementary to the president's peace through strength agenda. And it will be crystal clear that you will speak for the president in this regard. If you're focused on finding innovative ways to blend America's comparative advantages in this global fight against Chinese communists, I strongly believe you will be a boon to the president and to the United States of America. I would like to hear your strategic vision for the next 4 years. I'd like to hear your comments on the plans I have released for rebuilding and reforming the military. In confirming Secretary Hegseth, we charged him with focusing on 4 guiding principles as he assumed office: lethality, efficiency, speed, and accountability. I also appreciate the easy access that he and I have had in conversations with each other since his confirmation. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I'd like to know how you plan to execute in these 4 areas to support President Trump's peace through strength agenda. So thank you very much for being here. We look forward to your testimony, and I now recognize Ranking Member Reed for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, congratulations on your nomination and welcome to today's hearing. I would also like to recognize your wife, Susanna, and sons Orlando and Thomas, and your parents, siblings, and family members with us today. I would also, in anticipation of his arrival, like to welcome the Vice President and certainly my colleague, Senator Banks. Thank you. Mr. Colby, you have been nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, or the USDP. The USDP serves as a principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense and plays a critical role in developing long-term strategic policies of the department. If confirmed, you would lead defense policy at a consequential time. There is a common understanding that the future of our national security is tied significantly to our competition with China. This competition is occurring across every field of national power: military, economic, political, technological, and more, and across every region of the world. Mr. Colby, as you have written extensively, America's success in this competition will depend on our credibility in the eyes of our allies and our adversaries. If our allies in the Indo-Pacific perceive us to be untrustworthy or unreliable, they will hesitate to stand with us when we need them. And if China believes that we can be worn down through cajoling or bullying, they will take bold risks. And I'm deeply concerned that the Trump administration is surrendering our credibility at this very moment. For 3 years, the United States has stood with Ukraine and with our NATO allies in the face of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked bloody assault on Ukraine. Indeed, for the better part of a century, we have stood against Russia's aggression and been the global standard bearer of democracy. But now, after barely a month in office, President Trump has attacked this legacy and signaled he would rather align with the United States with Vladimir Putin than our democratic allies. Make no mistake, China is watching. We should be proud that the United States has led a formidable group of nations to support Ukraine and defend democracy on the world stage. However, President Trump seems eager to strike a deal with Vladimir Putin at any cost, even conceding our most valuable points of leverage before reaching the negotiating table. His recent claim that Ukraine, not Russia, started this war is offensive, and his attacks against President Zelensky are badly misguided. Frankly, the spectacle in the Oval Office last week was a failure of American leadership. President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine are fighting for their very lives, and to suggest that they are ungrateful for American aid is absurd. Many of my colleagues and I, including those here today, have traveled to Ukraine many times and seen firsthand the death and destruction wrought by Vladimir Putin against innocent people. To deride Ukraine or our allies is a mistake that only benefits Putin. Just last night, President Trump cut off all military aid to Ukraine. Make no mistake, his callous decision will only endanger innocent Ukrainians and encourage Russia to escalate its attacks. The United States is paying with money. The Ukrainians are paying with their lives. The administration's actions are doing great harm to America's standing in the world, showing anyone who is paying attention that the United States can no longer be trusted. President Xi is certainly taking notice. Thank you. Mr. Colby, you have argued against U.S. support for Ukraine and called for steep reductions to America's role in Europe. I asked you to explain these views and how, if confirmed, you would work to repair America's standing with our allies, as well as our competitive position with respect to our adversaries. The Department of Defense has long built its strategy around the idea of winning in an armed conflict and deterring China through military dominance. That is no longer enough. The game has changed, and our capacity for outright victory through military strength should not be our only measure of success. The Defense Department needs to better understand China's strategy for increasing its capabilities and influence, including in the so-called gray zone. Below the threshold of traditional armed conflict, we must also develop new tools for competition and integrate our activities with those of our allies and partners. Mr. Colby, you have written and spoken extensively about these concepts. You are a lead author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and have played an important role in defense policy through your previous positions in the department and at a number of think tanks. I would ask for your views on how the Department of Defense should pursue competition and deterrence with China, especially as it relates to the United States' relationship with Taiwan and our network of allies in the region. I would also like to know your priorities for the forthcoming round of defense policy reviews, including the next National Defense Strategy. You have also argued that the United States must rigorously prioritize our efforts on great power competition with China to include withdrawing forces from other theaters. I agree that we should be thoughtful and disciplined about how we use the military. That is why I am skeptical of the President's deployment of thousands of troops to the southern border and Guantanamo Bay. Border security and immigration enforcement are critical to our national security, but these current missions are dubious at best. The department estimates that it will spend $1 billion to $2 billion for unplanned border missions this year, even as illegal migrant encounters are at the lowest level since August of 2020. The Government Accountability Office has assessed these missions in recent years and found, quote, separating units in order to assign a portion of them to the Southwest border mission was a consistent trend in degrading readiness ratings. Mr. Colby, I have serious doubts about these missions. I would like to know what role you believe military forces should play in border security and whether the Defense Department should be involved in enforcing immigration policies that fall in the purview of the Department of Homeland Security and are essentially law enforcement operations, which posse comitatus circumscribes dramatically for the military. Finally, you will need to reconcile your views with the current longstanding bipartisan approach of the United States to the Middle East. The region remains extremely unstable after more than a year of violence between Israel, Hamas, Iran, and its proxies, and the fall of the Assad regime. Mr. Colby, you have advocated for a much more limited role in the region and suggested that the U.S. should be willing to tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. I hope you will address your reviews on these issues and how you would work to advance U.S. national security interests in the Middle East. If confirmed, you will lead at a challenging moment. All of our potential adversaries, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, are seeking ways to undermine our interests and supplant our leadership. I would ask for your plans on how the department can pursue every available opportunity to advance our national interests. I certainly look forward to your testimony. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And before we proceed, guests and members, including the chair, are sternly admonished to silence all phones and electronic devices. Mr. Vice President, I see that you have arrived and you are next on our list. Thank you very much for joining us this morning to introduce your friend and the nominee, and I now turn to you for your comments. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Wicker, and thanks to the ranking member, Senator Reed, and thanks to all my friends from across the aisle who permit this brief intrusion into what was otherwise, I'm sure, a very distinguished and interesting conversation. But I wanted to be here because I thought it was important to tell you all about my friend Bridge Colby and why I think he's important to the president's defense policy and important to what the president is trying to accomplish with national security. So first, I think Bridge, more than any person I've ever spoken to, appreciates that military power, national security influence is downstream of economic power. As we've seen in so many of the conflicts that we've engaged ourselves in over the last 30 or 40 years, we cannot fight wars unless our troops have the ammunition they need. We cannot defend our own national security unless we have the tank shells, the artillery shells, and increasingly the drones and other advanced weapon systems that are necessary to actually fight battles when, God forbid, those battles are necessary to fight. And I think Bridge has been particularly aware of and worried about the degradation of our defense industrial base and how we must rebuild it if we want to preserve our own national security. I've had many conversations with Bridge before I was a United States Senator, certainly before I was the Vice President of the United States, where in so many ways, Bridge predicted what we would be talking about 4 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. He saw around corners that very few other people were seeing around. That doesn't mean he's always right about every issue or that you'll agree with him on every issue. And I say that to both the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee. But I think that he's the type of perspective that we need so desperately at the Department of Defense. And I think that his role at the Department of Defense will be incredibly important in seeing around the corners of the next 5 years and the next 10 years. And that's one of the most important reasons why I think we should support his nomination at this great committee, but obviously support his confirmation in the United States Senate. Let me say a couple of other things about Bridge, and then I'll let you guys get on with the committee hearing. First of all, Bridge is a person of incredible integrity and intellect. His educational credentials are extraordinary. But to my Democratic friends, I think you also find he's a person who can actually work across the aisle. If you look at his long career in defense policy, he has said things that is, frankly, alienated Democrats and Republicans. He's also said things that I think both Democrats and Republicans would agree with. He obviously is a conservative. He obviously is the nominee of President Trump, and we nominated him because we think he's going to do a great job. But I think you'll find that he's the kind of guy that you can engage in meaningful conversation, whatever your agreement or disagreement with his views is. And again, that's one of the things that we need to bring to the Department of Defense. Bridge is a good guy. And I said this in the only other confirmation hearing that I actually introduced to guests of Secretary Lutnick. You need good people in government. You need people who are going to tell you the truth, who are going to look you in the eye, who are going to disagree, sometimes amicably, of course, but actually be willing to look you in the eye and have an important conversation, who you can trust to tell you what they actually think, agree or disagree. And that's the kind of person that Bridge is. He's a great family man. He comes from a life of service, but also a family of service going back many generations. And he's the kind of guy that we need working on policy at the senior levels of the Department of Defense. And of course, that's why the president nominated him. And the final thing that I want to say about Bridge is so much of this question of rebuilding the industrial base. And I think it's one of the few areas of genuine bipartisan agreement. We may not always agree exactly how to do it, but I think everybody pretty much agrees that we have to build the industrial base in the United States that can support the national security policy of the next generation. Whether you have a Democrat or Republican president 20 years from now, you need to ensure that the troops who are under the command of that commander-in-chief actually have the weapon systems necessary to support themselves and to accomplish the mission. That's not a simple matter of throwing money at the problem. That's not a simple matter of saying we need to buy more weapons. It also goes deeply into questions of procurement. How are we buying those weapons? How are we engaging with the technologists of the 21st century? Because we're never going to beat China in a war of population. They have, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and we've got just north of 300 million. But what we can do is actually have the kind of technology that gives our troops and gives our people the advantage over the long haul. And that means not just buying more weapons, that means being smart about how we buy weapons in a way that enhances our technological edge and ensures that upstarts, not just the big five incumbents, but upstarts can participate in the process of procurement and of giving our troops the weapon systems that they need. So I think that we need to think deeply about these questions. I think that President Trump and the Department of Defense, Secretary Hegseth on down, are thinking deeply about these questions. Bridge Colby is an important part, not just of thinking about these questions, but also accomplishing important policy. And so with all respect to all of you and knowing that all of you will make up your own minds, I highly encourage you to give Bridge Colby your stamp of approval. He's a good guy, he's a smart guy, and he'll do a good job for the United States of America. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Vice President. We appreciate you being here, and I know you're busy, but we certainly would be delighted to have you stay around. Thank you so much. Senator Banks.
Thank you, Mr.
Can you
Chairman.
top that?
It's hard to follow our good friend.
You're
but
recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, fellow members of the most important committee in the entire Congress, the Senate Armed Services Committee. It's good to be with all of you today to introduce my friend, Elbridge Colby, the President's choice to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon. I've known Elbridge Colby, or Bridge, for a very long time. I got to know him in the first Trump term, but he became an advisor to me when I served on the House Armed Services Committee. And even more importantly, he became deeply involved in the Republican Study Committee that I chaired, the largest caucus on Capitol Hill in the House, helping us to understand the world, how to talk about it, what to do about the complex issues around the world. The threats that we face around the world are increasingly sophisticated, but I'm confident that with Bridge in charge of developing and implementing our defense strategy, America will be wholly prepared. Bridge already knows his way around the Pentagon from his time as a senior official in OSD policy in the first Trump term, the very office, by the way, that we're considering his nomination for today. He's eminently qualified for this role. While in OSD, he co-led and was the key architect of the development of President Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy. After 2 decades of prioritizing wars in the Middle East, the National Defense Strategy under Bridge and the first Trump administration rightly refocused the U.S. military on great power competition with China and maintaining American superiority in the Pacific. Bridge has been a leader in courageously stating this truth: America's focus must be on the military threat from communist China, and the U.S. and our allies are running out of time to act on it. Bridge has written numerous reports and articles on foreign policy and defense, as well as his widely studied book, The Strategy of Denial, which I will admit is dry, but incredibly substantive. And I recommend that every member of this committee read his book. I believe his answers to your question today will underline his expertise, his unique qualifications for this role and this position. He will make an excellent Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I look forward to working with all of you as fellow members of this committee to swiftly confirm his nomination and get him on the job. You won't be disappointed. Mr. Chairman, thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you today.
Thank you very, very much, Senator Banks. And you are welcome to resume your seat or to stay there at the desk. But thank you very much. And again, our thanks to our Vice President. Mr. Colby, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the Armed Services Committee, it is an exceptional personal honor to appear before you today to be considered for the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I would like to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to President Trump for nominating me for this role. I'm committed to implementing his vision of a defense and foreign policy of putting Americans' interests first and of peace through strength. I am deeply honored by the President's confidence in me. Thank you in particular to Vice President Vance for his exceptionally kind introduction and his confidence. I am profoundly honored by his support and presence here today. And thank you very much to Senator Jim Banks for his incredibly generous introduction. I'm deeply honored as well. I would also like to express my great gratitude to Secretary of Defense Hegseth for his support and confidence. I would also like to thank the members of this committee for their consideration. I have very much appreciated my engagement with you and your staffs over the last weeks and have learned a great deal. If confirmed, I would look forward to deepening this engagement. Finally, I would like especially to express my personal thanks to my family for their love and support, especially to my wife, Susanna, and our sons, Orlando and Thomas, seated behind me. I would also like to thank my parents, Jonathan and Susan, as well as other family members and friends present here today, as well as the family and friends who are not here but have supported me in this process and throughout my life and career. Members of this committee, with your permission, I will keep my opening remarks brief. The position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is a role that comes with genuinely profound and grave responsibilities. And my nomination comes at a time, as this committee has eloquently laid out, of deep peril for our country. Peace and the protection of American interests in the world cannot be assumed. There is a real risk of major war, and we cannot afford to lose one. I recognize these realities in my bones. It is my great hope that we can get through the coming years peacefully, with strength, in ways that put us and our alliances on a stronger and more sustainable footing. If confirmed, I would do all in my power to make it so. I know some of you will have different views on important issues, but I can assure you of several things. That I am deeply committed to a foreign and defense policy that realistically protects and advances all American security, freedoms, and prosperity. That I'm willing and ready to engage with those who disagree with me and adapt my views based on persuasive arguments and the facts. That I value our alliances deeply, even as I think they must be adapted. And that I love our great country and will put its interests first and foremost. If confirmed, I pledge to strive with every fiber to meet the grave responsibilities of this important office with judgment, commitment, and determination. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, I am required to ask you a number of questions, which we ask all nominees. So have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have, Senator.
Have you assumed any duties or taken any actions that would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
I have not, Senator.
Exercising our legislative and oversight responsibilities makes it important that this committee, its subcommittees, and other appropriate committees of Congress receive testimony, briefings, reports, records, and other information from the executive branch on a timely basis. Mr. Colby, do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify before this committee when requested?
I do, Senator.
Do you agree to provide records, documents, and electronic communications in a timely manner when requested by this committee, its subcommittees, or other appropriate committees of Congress, and to consult with the requester regarding the basis for any good faith, delay, or denial on your part in providing such records?
I do, Senator.
Will you ensure that your staff complies with deadlines established by this committee for the production of reports, records, and other information, including timely responding to hearing questions for the record?
I will, Senator.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
I will, Senator.
Will those witnesses and briefers be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will, Senator.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to begin a round of 5-minute questions. I'm going to a round of questions limited to 5 minutes per member, and I'm going to hold myself as chair to that 5 minutes also. So at this point, let me begin by asking about a couple of policy advisors that are already in place. One of your advisors, if confirmed, would be Mr. Michael Domino. You did not choose Mr. Domino for that.
Senator, no, I was not the hiring person.
He said recently, there are no vital, a quote, there are no vital or existential U.S. interest in the Middle East, unquote. Mr. Colby, to your understanding, does that reflect the president's policy in the Middle East?
Senator, I think that the president has made clear that we do have really important interests in the Middle East.
Does Mr. Domino's policy pronouncement reflect your own views?
Senator, no, I wouldn't. He does not speak for me, and I think I have a number of views that differ materially from his, from what I understand, just in public reporting.
Another policy advisor is Mr. Andrew Byers. He's an advisor on Southeast Asia. He believes that thinking about communist China through the lens of deterrence is wrong. He thinks maybe we should give up what he calls, quote, belligerent policies toward China and see if they will reciprocate. He apparently thinks pressing Beijing on trade is a bad idea. So, Mr. Colby, does that reflect the president's policy, our President Trump's policy on China, in your view?
It does not, Senator, and I would say that it does not reflect mine. I mean, as I think Senator Banks and the Vice President kindly mentioned, I wrote a book really focused on the lens of deterrence. And of course, as the Vice President, I think rightly mentioned, we also need to be thinking about the economic dimension. And of course, the administration's already taking measures in that direction. So it seems, again, I'm not intimately familiar with this work, but it seems like a quite different perspective than my own.
And I do understand that you've made no determination as to whether Mr. Domino and or Mr. Byers will be retained in those positions.
Sir, as part of not presuming, my understanding is that I should not be even sort of thinking in that way. Senator, what I would say is that if confirmed, obviously I would be only one person in a chain, including, of course, the Secretary of Defense, the Presidential Personnel Office, and ultimately the President, the Vice President, and so forth. But what I would commit to you is that anybody in my organization, if I'm confirmed, should be in line with the President's agenda, including the issues that you mentioned.
Very well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I have appreciated what I view as your clear articulation of the core U.S. interest in Taiwan, which are too infrequently discussed in the public here in America. As you wrote in American Compass last year, quote, "Nothing that could happen abroad is more plausibly and gravely threatening to Americans than China invading Taiwan." Unquote. Your 2022 article at Stanford has about as good a one-paragraph summary of our interest in Taiwan as I've seen. Yet in November of last year, some people believe your position may have taken a marked turn as you wrote, quote, "America has a strong interest in defending Taiwan, but Americans could survive without it." So, Mr. Colby, I'll let you respond to that, but specifically, can the United States enjoy a golden age for America with increasing prosperity for our citizens in this century if we fail to deter China in Taiwan, or worse yet, lose that war?
Well, thanks, Senator. Losing Taiwan's fall would be a disaster for American interests. What the underlying logic behind my position is that the military balance vis-a-vis China, as you, sir, and your committee members, fellow committee members have amply and eloquently pointed out, has deteriorated dramatically. What I have been trying to shoot a signal flare over is that it is vital for us to focus and enable our own forces for an effective and reasonable defense of Taiwan, and for the Taiwanese as well as the Japanese to do more. So my position in terms of the value of Taiwan is consistent, but what I'm very fearful of, Senator, and I think this is agreed across administrations of both parties, is that, the military balance has declined. So what I'm trying to avoid a situation in which, because we are not adequately prepared, we get in a situation, the analogy I like to use is Winston Churchill in 1940 wanting to send Spitfires and Hurricanes to the Battle of France, but Marshal doubting, saying, if we do that, we're not going to be prepared to be able to defend the home islands. That's a sort of an extreme example, but
How
that's
soon
what I'm
will
trying
it
to
take
avoid.
us to get prepared?
It would be essentially my number one, or one of my very top priorities, if confirmed, to try to get us prepared as quickly as possible, and then over the medium and longer term as well, Senator.
And you and I are absolutely united on that.
Right.
Thank you very much, Chairman Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Colby, you've advocated a reduction in support for Ukraine, which you characterize as a distraction from Taiwan. Yet, former CIA Director Bill Burns, one of the most astute commentators about Russia, former ambassador, CIA Director, stated that no one is watching U.S. support for Ukraine more closely than Chinese leaders. And, quote, "One of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of American fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness would be to abandon support for Ukraine." So what message are the president's actions sending?
Well, Senator, I'd say a couple things. One, my arguments about Ukraine have been based on the need for strategic prioritization. I don't contest the fact that the Chinese are looking at what we're doing in Ukraine at all. But fundamentally, Senator, my view, and I think it should be of particular interest to this committee, sir, is that we have to have the military capabilities in Asia or relevant to Asia to be able to conduct a local defense of Taiwan at a cost and level of risk that the American people are prepared to tolerate. And that has been my main focus. My aspiration if I would put another, and to kind of build on what the Vice President was saying, a longer term top priority for me would be, if confirmed, would be to revivify our defense industrial base so that we are no longer in a position where our defense industrial base cannot produce at levels where we can resource in multiple theaters at the level that we need. That's where we want to get back to.
Well, I don't think there's a dispute about reinvigorating the industrial base. I think, though, there is, from astute personalities like Bill Burns, the fear that we're sending dramatically the wrong lesson. Indeed, on December 2023, you stated, quote, "The invasion of Ukraine is an evil act by the Russians, and I morally support the Ukrainian defense." Do you still agree with that statement?
Senator, I think I stand by my record, but at this point, I think there's a very delicate diplomatic process going on where the president is rightfully trying to resuscitate the peace process, and I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to weigh in on the specific case.
The president indicated the Russians invaded Ukraine, which is completely erroneous, and that Zelensky is a dictator, which is, I think, also erroneous. And we're in an awkward situation now. He's cutting every sort of tool we have. And that's not the way to negotiate. I don't think that was in the art of the deal. So I think we're in a very serious situation. Let me change topics for a moment. General Mattis, who I respect immensely as former Secretary of Defense and as a Marine, stated, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition," which raises the question of the wisdom of eviscerating the USAID. In many places in the world, and you know this, that's the only American presence. That's the counterpoint to Chinese incursions all across the globe. And now we've put them out of business. And it's been indicated that this will cause millions of unnecessary deaths, particularly of children and women. And it seems to be undercutting our power in the world, our soft power. Your thoughts?
Well, Senator, I think it's certainly very important to have an effective and efficient diplomatic arm, the State Department, as well as a development arm. And I would certainly support that. Would not be within my purview, obviously, a number of the issues that you're raising, if confirmed. But I certainly support a tight interaction and integration with the other arms of national power, especially in an era as we said in Secretary Mattis's defense strategy, where we are no longer in a kind of unipolar militarily dominant situation.
With respect to NATO, I mean, one of the fallouts from our Ukrainian decisions over the last few days is that our European allies feel essentially abandoned, that the NATO alliance is as fragile as it's ever been. And as we all recognize, NATO was the key for the last, since 1949, to our ability to stabilize the world and to promote a democratic and economic agenda that favored the West. And that's in danger now. The president in his last term was insisting on 2% for everybody at NATO. Now it's more almost like a landlord saying, "I'm raising the rent unless you do something, something, something." Do you believe the NATO alliance has made us stronger, and that if it's jeopardized, we will be in serious trouble?
Senator, I believe that the NATO alliance has been an exceptionally successful alliance, but I think if we're going to sustain it, it needs to move in the direction that President Trump is leading it in, and where I think the Europeans are finally moving. If you look at Chancellor Merz, who's coming in Germany, or President Macron, or Prime Minister Starmer, they're not only spending more. 2% is manifestly inadequate. General Cavoli has said that. Many others have said that. They need to see real combat capabilities. The conversation has materially improved in recent months and over the last few years, where we can get NATO into a more balanced fashion. And Senator, I believe that that's much more consistent with the model of NATO that existed during the Cold War, rather than the post-Cold War model, which is too heavily lopsided in American responsibility, and it needs to change to be sustained.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colby. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Mr. Colby, welcome. Welcome to you and your family and friends. In your answers to the committee's advanced policy questions, you stated that, quote, U.S. nuclear forces underpin our entire deterrence and defense posture, end quote. And that quote, ensuring we retain a modern, capable, and effective nuclear deterrent should be our top priority, end quote. I agree with those statements. Nuclear deterrence must be the foundation for any defense strategy. However, this foundation is threatened because of decades of underinvestment and poor management. I'm confident this administration can correct the course of our modernization programs, both through adequate resourcing and by approving our acquisition strategies for Sentinel, Columbia, and B-21. Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you commit to working with this committee to fully modernize all aspects of our nuclear triad and continuing the work of the first Trump administration to rebuild our nation's most important military capabilities?
I do, Senator.
Thank you. Russia has nearly completed their modernization of all of their nuclear forces, and China's modernizing and they're growing their arsenal at a breathtaking speed. Yet the combination of an industrial base that we continually worry about in this country and overly complicated acquisition policies, it holds us back from keeping pace. You've talked about that. The Vice President talked about that in his introduction to you as well. If confirmed, what policies would you recommend to increase the overall capacity of that industrial base?
Well, Senator, I think actually a number of the things that the Vice President has spoken about and the President, which is that a broader reindustrialization, in my view, is necessary to fix a lot of the defense industrial base issues, not just with the nuclear forces as critical as they are, but also with the broader conventional forces as well, which is to say, and I know this committee has drawn attention to this problem, that despite the investment of money, often the results are less than people would like to see, for instance, because of workforce issues. So if confirmed, I wouldn't approach the problem with saying I have all of the particular policy ideas set and I'm going to, in terms of improving the industrial production. But what I would see my role as making very clear that revamping and restoring a really healthy and robust defense industrial base is absolutely a national priority. And what I've said as a private commentator, but I believe as a public official, if confirmed, is that we kind of need a national mobilization of our defense industrial base. We need to be able to get better results, and it seems to me that's something that could get wide agreement.
Do you have in mind any acquisition policies that you would revamp at this point in time, that you would recommend changing or even eliminating?
Senator, I at this point, I wouldn't have any specific ones. I know a lot of those would be under the purview of the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition and other, the service secretaries and so forth. I would be delighted to dive into that issue further and give you a more concrete answer. But again, I would see my role, if confirmed, as the USDP to kind of drive the overall strategic direction that we need to get better results out of our defense industrial base.
Should we utilize the Defense Production Act?
I think that absolutely would make sense. And deregulation in general at that level, I think all options should be on the table including things that seem pretty dramatic, because I think, as the chairman rightly said, we live in a very dramatic situation and world.
The department's also modernizing our NC3, and that's which the Strategic Forces Subcommittee calls the fourth leg of our triad. If confirmed, will you ensure that this effort receives the necessary attention and the resources that it needs?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Would you prioritize it as one of, along with our triad, as the top priority of the department?
Certainly. I mean, I think command and control is absolutely essential. And when we're living in a world of much more capable cyber capabilities, not to mention missile threats, not just the traditional strategic strike threats, but also a range of different threats that are evolving very quickly, we have to absolutely pay really critical attention to NC3.
Thank you, Mr. Colby.
Thank you.
Senator Gillibrand, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for appearing here. Thank you for bringing your family. This is a very significant role you are undertaking that takes enormous amounts of responsibility and thoughtful judgment. I want to talk about the threats we are facing from around the globe. We've continued to see cyber threats from Russia. We had SolarWinds. We had the Colonial Pipeline compromise. We had the 2016 effort to undermine our electoral infrastructure. It was reported last week that Secretary Hegseth ordered a halt on Cybercom's offensive operations against Russia. We have not heard anything from Russia that they are similarly disarming. What advice will you give to President Trump with regard to how to keep the United States safe from Russian attacks through cyber and other means?
Senator, I haven't seen the actual documents. So I only have what I'm going on based on public reporting. But my recommendation would be that we should maintain the highest level of cyber vigilance and capability vis-a-vis Russia, as well as others like China.
Would you unilaterally disarm and not use offensive operations?
Senator, I don't know exactly what's going on. I couldn't comment about what's going on, but generally, I think these reciprocal steps in the sort of logic of arms control, steps should be reciprocated credibly.
Correct. Would you consider Russia to be postured as an adversary or as an ally?
I think we need, from a military point of view, from a defense point of view, Senator, as I put in my responses to the advanced policy questions, Russia presents a significant military threat to Europe, and there are significant military threats to the homeland as well. And I think from a defense point of view, we need to regard that in a very clear-eyed way. At the same time, as an overall strategy, I think that can support and be compatible with an effort to diminish, the potential for direct confrontation with Russia in the same way with China as well.
Who started the war in Ukraine?
Senator, as I said earlier, I think this is a very delicate diplomatic time. I've spoken about this in the past. I would hate to be in a situation of disrupting or inhibiting progress on peace. I think the president and the vice president have been very clear that words matter, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to be commenting on these delicate topics.
Given that you won't make a public statement with regard to it, will you tell this committee that you will advise President Trump on the truth of all matters?
Well, Senator, I absolutely would commit to you that I would tell the truth in the conduct of my duties.
With regard to China, you are aware of Volt Typhoon, you are aware of Salt Typhoon, you are aware of Flax Typhoon. Do you agree that China poses a cyber threat to the United States and has pre-positioned cyber threats around the United States to be able to use them should and when it needs to in any conflict with regard to Taiwan?
Senator, I should say that my information is based on public reporting, but based on what you're saying, that is consistent with my understanding, and so I would agree with your assessment.
What advice will you give to President Trump with regard to how to posture appropriately to protect against incursions by China to the United States' national security?
Well, Senator, this is something that I would want to dive much more deeply in, as cyber is obviously an area where a lot of the information is classified, and I don't haven't had access to that in some time, certainly not on the cyber issue. What I would say, Senator, and I talked about this in my responses to the advanced policy questions, is I would bring my background in the area of deterrence and these kinds of areas, denial and so forth, to bring an integrated approach that includes things like resilience, defenses, but also cyber offensive operations and capabilities, intelligence gathering and so forth. And my understanding is there has been good work on this in previous years that can be built on, but there could be some sensible policy changes that are on the table that could be worth taking. Again, I don't know enough to say specifically, though, Senator.
I'd be interested in what sensible policy changes you're interested in. I'm highly concerned that should China decide to invade Taiwan, that we haven't done enough cyber defense domestically to prevent the type of chaos that these types of attacks have already created, whether it's Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon or Flax Typhoon. Every single one of them is designed to create enormous chaos and instability and would create decision-making that would be, at a minimum, challenging and chaotic.
Senator, I fully share your concerns based on what I'm seeing. Not only would it cause chaos, but it could specifically inhibit or break down U.S. military operations. So I share your alarm. I'm not read into a lot of the real specifics.
So I'd like to work with you on what your plan will be for cybersecurity for both incursions from Russia, from China going forward. And in my last 8 minutes, can you just speak briefly about your view with regard to Iran and the threat they pose to the United States and our allies?
I'd welcome working with you on cyber. Just briefly, I will say that Iran does pose a very severe threat to the United States and our allies, especially our key ally, Israel. I think I'll have a chance to elaborate on that given the time situation.
Thank you very much. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Colby, welcome. Let's talk about the threat of a nuclear Iran. I have some concerns about what you've said in the past, namely that if we had to choose between hoping to contain a nuclear Iran and preventing Iran with military force from getting nukes, that we should tolerate a nuclear Iran and try to contain it. For instance, you've written that, quote, containing a nuclear Iran is eminently plausible and practical objective. You've approvingly cited the view that, quote, the only thing worse than the prospect of an Iran armed with nuclear weapons would be the consequences of using force to try to stop them. That's certainly not my view, but more important, it's not President Trump's policy. He has said for more than a decade that Iran cannot be allowed to get nuclear weapons. He declared in a national security presidential memorandum last month that a nuclear Iran, quote, poses an existential danger to the United States and can never be allowed to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. In your written answers to the committee's advanced questions, you now seem to echo President Trump's policy. You wrote, for example, the United States should deny Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. So it seems that we all agree that Iran cannot be allowed to get nukes. The question is how to stop them. Let me be clear up front on a couple points. First, I think everyone would welcome a diplomatic deal in which Iran completely turns over its nuclear program, as Libya did in 2003. And second, I don't think anyone here advocates for invading and occupying Iran for a decade to stop its nuclear program. I certainly don't. But here's the question. Diplomacy fails. Iran is racing to a bomb. We have a choice. Tolerate a nuclear Iran and hope to contain it. Use military force to stop Iran from going nuclear. In that case, will you commit to providing the president with credible, realistic military options to stop Iran from going nuclear?
I do commit to that, Senator.
And to be more precise, those credible and realistic options are more than simply saying we can give Israel some bombs and they can take care of it.
Yes, I agree with you, Senator.
It's well known that Israel lacks certain military capabilities that we have, such as aerial refueling tankers and heavy bombers with deep penetrating ordnance. Do you believe that at least one option for the president to consider how to stop Iran from going nuclear should be to use our tankers and our bombers, whether in tandem with Israel or in the lead?
Senator, I wouldn't want to get ahead of the president on specific decisions, but I think those are the kinds of things that should be absolutely part of this the discussion. And if I were confirmed, those would certainly be the kinds of things that I would raise for the consideration of the Secretary and ultimately the president.
Thank you. And to be clear about why this is so important to us, to the United States, not just to Israel or our Arab friends, why President Trump says a nuclear Iran is an existential danger to us. You agree that it's an existential danger, not just a severe danger, as you said in response to Senator Gillibrand, or a significant one, as you said in your written answers.
Yes, a nuclear armed Iran, especially, Senator, given that they, as we've discussed, that they've looked into, or we know they've worked on ICBM range capabilities and other kinds of capabilities that would pose an existential danger to the United States.
So they have a space launch program, which is flimsy cover for an intercontinental missile program that could be used to hit us here in Washington, in Little Rock, or elsewhere in the continental United States. It is an immediate threat to Israel and our Arab friends, but it is a threat in the not too distant future, probably in just a couple of years, to the United States.
Senator, I don't have access to the intelligence information, but that sounds very consistent to me.
And do you agree that providing President Trump with those credible military options is actually one way to increase leverage to have an airtight diplomatic deal?
Yes, I do agree.
That a lack of military options would make it harder to get a deal?
I do. I think.
Thank you. I want to turn briefly to Taiwan. You have said here today and in your past writings that Taiwan is a critical matter for us. You wrote in 2016 that you thought we should give explicit security guarantees to Taiwan, reversing a decades-old policy of strategic ambiguity. You opined in the same way in 2020 in response to a hearing in the House of Representatives. Over the past couple of years, you've started to say, as Senator Wicker pointed out earlier, that Taiwan is a vital interest, but it's not existential interest to us, or it's not essential to us. It seems that you have changed your thoughts somewhat in the last couple of years. That is not, I suspect, because of Taiwan's defense spending, which, though still inadequate, I agree, has been trending upward for 7 straight years. So could you explain to us why in the last few years your views seem to have softened somewhat about the defense of Taiwan?
Absolutely, Senator. I've always said that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but as you said, it's not an existential interest. It's very important. The core American interest is in denying China regional hegemony. What's changed, Senator, as we discussed, is the dramatic deterioration in the military balance. So if I could use the Churchill example again, it's different to engage in a futile and overly costly effort that would destroy our military. And I know you've written very eloquently about this danger in your recent book. And the other point that I would say, Senator, is that I believe that we actually have implicitly our relationship and our commitment to Taiwan is largely implicit or indirect or customary. We actually have specified our commitment through things like the designation of Taiwan as the pacing scenario for the department. So my view that the combination of the greater threat from China and the lack of preparedness on our part, I have a different assessment with respect, Senator, about Taiwan's efforts. I think actually as a proportion of GDP, it's well below 3%. I agree with President Trump that they should be more like 10% or at least something in that ballpark, really focused on their defense. So we need to properly incentivize them. So together, that means that my focus has been, again, with the shooting the flare metaphor I used earlier, Senator, to get Taiwan motivated to avoid precipitating a conflict that is not necessary with Beijing and giving us time and space to be able to try to rectify this problem, because that is my goal, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Blumenthal. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Colby, to you and your family. I asked the following two initial questions with relevance to fitness to serve. So I'll ask you, since you became a legal adult, have you ever made unwanted requests for sexual favors or committed any verbal or physical harassment or assault of a sexual nature?
I have not, Senator.
Have you ever faced discipline or entered into a settlement relating to this kind of conduct?
I have not, Senator.
I think it's interesting that you would not say whether Russia invaded Ukraine and that saying that this is a complicated kind of a situation right now. But I think I also heard you say that you would give the president your best advice regardless of what you think he might want to hear. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. Relating to whether Russian military forces invaded Ukraine. In February 2022, did Russian forces cross the border and invade Ukraine? Yes or no?
Well, Senator, you're describing a factual reality that is demonstrably true.
Yes, so that would mean that Russia invaded Ukraine. So that was a question that you would not answer. I think that's pretty important because if we care about what Xi Jinping thinks about what this president does and thinks. And if Xi Jinping thinks that we have a president who does not separate fact from fiction, such as who invaded Ukraine, I would think that maybe President Xi has some conclusions that he would draw, maybe having to do with, as our ranking member said, U.S. fecklessness. And I also think that one of the reasons that our NATO allies are increasing their spending on military is that they do not think that they have a particularly stable partner in the U.S., and therefore they better look to their own interests because they can no longer rely on the U.S. I think that is a very bad situation for the United States to be in, especially as we identify China as a pacing threat, and also whatever Russia is thinking along these lines, they think that they now have a friend in the president. I don't think that helps us vis-a-vis our strength regarding Russia, regarding China. In fact, I think that we are placing ourselves in a very weakened position with regard to how we are viewed by our adversaries, that would be China as well as Russia, and our allies. Are not a good situation to be in. We need a president who can separate fact from fiction. Let me move on. Since the administration has identified China as a pacing threat and the importance of Indo-PACOM to face that threat, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think the department has identified China as the pacing.
So, but Indo-PACOM provided Congress with an $11 billion unfunded priorities list. And this says to me that there is a misalignment of our funding decisions and strategy. If we consider Indo-PACOM to be a priority, and yet you have Indo-PACOM putting forward an $11 billion unfunded priorities. What would you do to decrease the unfunded priorities and align our strategy and the importance of Indo-PACOM with the resources that it gets? And would you agree that maybe we should provide Indo-PACOM with more direct input into the department's budgeting and resourcing priorities?
Well, Senator, what I'd like to say is,
Process.
if I may, is I think this is exactly the kind of baseline reality that I think so much of my strategic argumentation proceeds from. A lot of what I'm saying is that, many of us in the public debate and so forth are acting as if we can do everything. But the reality is that there's an $11 billion unfunded priority list from Indo-PACOM. And realistically, I bet the real deficit is even higher, given that that's just what came out. So, Senator, if confirmed, I would make it an absolute priority, given the priority that China must get across administrations. I think this is now a matter of strategic consensus to try to not only drive that down, but to reform the department and reprioritize it, to actually go through and carry out the strategic shift that's been talked about in some ways since probably Bob Work was Deputy Secretary of Defense at the end of the Obama administration.
So would you agree that Indo-PACOM, that command should be provided with more direct input into the department's budgeting and resourcing process?
Senator, I don't have enough information to say specifically organizationally where I would fall on that, but certainly that perspective needs to get, I would say, an elevated.
I hope so, because in 11 billion unfunded priority, that is the largest unfunded priority list of any of our combatant commands. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Then, thank you. And let me observe, Mr. Colby, that I have been somewhat critical of the COCOMs that have not come forward with realistic unfunded requirements. And so I appreciate the exchange which you and Senator Hirono just had. Our next member is Senator Rounds. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, first of all, I really appreciated the time that I spent with you in my office. I appreciated your comments and thoughts. And to your family, thank you for allowing him to participate in this. It's going to mean a lot of time away, but it's the right thing to do. Mr. Colby, there's always an opportunity to look ahead and to see long-term what our needs are going to be in this country, particularly with the defense of our nation. And now that we recognize 5 different domains, air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, we also recognize that new ways of defending our country are needed as well. Space-based assets are one of those, in which, as the president's indicated, he would love to have a golden dome over our country or over the communities within our country. I don't think that's far-fetched. And in fact, I think it's something that we've really got to consider. Today, we have systems along our coastlines that protect many of our cities. Hawaii, as an example, is protected with destroyers that have radar capabilities and so forth. If the president were to be successful in creating an iron dome or a golden dome, he not only needs space-based assets, but he also needs land-based assets as well that require the use of certain parts of the spectrum for radar purposes. This committee would be shocked if I didn't bring this up with someone in front of us today that's going to have something to say about the use of the spectrum in the future. We talked about this in my office. Forcing the Department of Defense, as some people have suggested, to vacate any portion of the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band of the spectrum would have severe consequences on our warfighting capabilities, including homeland defense missions and force protection for our deployed forces. It's also that part of the spectrum that any land-based system would use to identify incoming weapons using radar. If confirmed, will you advocate for protecting the Department of Defense's warfighting systems that require spectrum to function optimally, including the radars that will make President Trump's Golden Dome possible?
I will, Senator.
And if confirmed, will you speak candidly with Congress on the effects of any spectrum-related policies entertained by the interagency that may have an effect on the Department of Defense's capabilities to use those portions of the spectrum that they currently control?
I will, Senator.
Thank you, sir. Sir, also in my office, you have and I consider you very courageously, you've called for the genuine focus on countering China as the principal threat to the United States and providing the commensurate resources to Indo-PACOM. In my office, we discussed the fact that in the event the U.S. and China engage in hostilities, adversaries like Russia and Iran will seek to press their own advantage in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. It's for that purpose that the NDAA currently requires a review to see whether or not we're actually capable and what our needs are to actually be able to sustain a war on more than one front. I'm convinced that if we have a war on one front, we're going to have a war on two fronts. Can you talk about what your thoughts are on that and whether or not in your role as a planner, you have to be able to respond to adversaries on more than one front?
Well, thank you, Senator. I really appreciate that, and I fully agree with your fear, and I know the chairman and others have made this a real concern, and I applaud the committee's focus on this point. We have to have a multi-front or multi-war strategy, even though the reality is that the force planning construct of the 2022 National Defense Strategy is not a three-war military or something. I think it's a one and change, if I could speak informally. So that is a real problem, because not only do I think that the other hostile actors could act opportunistically, I think there's a very good chance that, for instance, if China wanted to take the cosmic roll of the dice, as Harold Brown put it, that they would induce their other partners with whom they are now much more closely collaborating to also go at the same time, perhaps even before, to draw us away. So we have to have a strategy for that. I think our own strategy is to revamp our defense industrial base, the readiness, the president's very appropriate and justified desire to restore our military strength, more capable allies. So I have a different view than Senator Hirono. I think that what's happening in Europe is actually very positive, that the Europeans are saying we need to do more for our own defense. I think people now, having dealt with the Europeans ad nauseum for many years on this kind of thing, I think there's finally an acceptance that there really needs to be more to be done.
My time will run out, but I want to make something very clear on this. If we're expecting that our European allies are going to be able to defend us in the case of having a war on two fronts, I don't think we can do that. I think they can help us, but I think we have to be in a position to respond to that. Would you agree?
I think we have to be able to defend ourselves, obviously, without relying on anybody else, Senator, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Colby, who instigated the war in Gaza?
Well, the October 7th, the barbaric attacks against, Israel were the precipitating factor.
By Hamas.
By Hamas, yeah.
Yeah, so
Iran.
there's a delicate ceasefire negotiation going on right now, but you didn't have any trouble saying who was the instigator of the attack.
I would look at it differently, Senator,
you equivocated about the Russian invasion.
If I could stop both of my friends. There's been some talking over, and our stenographers having trouble. So if we could avoid that.
Yeah, you were introduced as a truth teller by the vice president. That's a really important thing. And my point is, if you're willing to say the truth about the Hamas invasion of Israel, I hope you wouldn't be equivocal about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me ask you about two particular topics. In your advanced policy questions on page 4748, you were asked a question about transnational criminal organizations. And I'm curious about this. TCOs, including those transporting fentanyl, pose a direct threat to Americans. I believe this is a very important matter for the U.S. government to address. The United States should do so in ways that are practical, results-oriented, and sustainable. In light of this, the lead organizations are likely normally to be non-DOD. You then went on to say the DOD plays an important role. Talk a little bit about the way you see the effort against TCOs, the lead role of non-DOD and the supporting role of DOD.
Well, thanks, Senator, and I know this is a special focus of yours, so this is something I'd want to learn more about, but I'm very conscious that, and this gets to some of the sort of back and forth in other contexts, that military force is not a panacea. It's critical. It needs to be part of the so-called, of the president's menu of options, and in certain cases, it's absolutely necessary and can solve a problem. But things like transnational criminal organizations that are, crime has been with us since we got out of the, out of the jungles or whatever. It's going to be there, but we can reduce it. I think a big part of that is going to be obviously integration with the diplomatic arms, with capable partners who are willing to and able to do more, for instance, in places like Latin America and other places as well. So I see DOD. I think it's important for the department to be more aware and active in those conversations. My impression, somewhat from within the department, but often from the outside, is that that's considered to be sort of out of the department's purview. I think it's important that the department be there, not necessarily always saying everything's to be solved with a hammer, but to be part of that conversation. And I'll say, I think the kind of people who are being populated in the senior levels of the State Department and elsewhere, the National Security Council, I would believe I could have a very good conversation and integration and collaboration along those lines, as well as Congress on these issues.
And I think when you talk to the Southcom leadership, they're going to really emphasize that a lot of non-DOD assets are very important in this fight. I want to ask you a question about AUKUS. Because I'm on foreign relations and armed services, I've been pretty involved in the AUKUS framework. Pillar 1 also is pretty heavily invested in Virginia. You did a tweet in August where you said, AUKUS, in principle, it's a great idea. But I've been very skeptical in practice. I remain skeptical, agnostic as I put it, but more inclined based on new information I've gleaned. It would be crazy to have fewer SSNs, Virginia class, in the right place and time. Talk a little bit about your perspective on AUKUS, the promise of the concept, and if there's practical skepticality, what that is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. And this is another area where, as I mentioned in my opening statement, where new facts arise. I mean, my perspective is fundamentally, I would say, realistic or pragmatic and kind of data-driven, if you want, adaptive, based on new facts. The idea of empowering our Australian, in some sense, perhaps our closest ally in the world, they've been with us even in our less advisable wars, is the way I put it. It's a great idea for them to have attack submarines. But the problem is that we are, as Secretary Rubio has said and others, there's a very real threat of a conflict in the coming years, God forbid, over, along the first island chain. And our attack submarines, as you know well, Senator, are absolutely essential for making the defense of Taiwan or otherwise a viable and practical option, to my conversation with Senator Cotton. So if we can produce the attack submarines in sufficient number and sufficient speed, then great. But if we can't, that becomes a very difficult problem, because we don't want our servicemen and women to be in a weaker position and more vulnerable, and God forbid worse, because they're not in the right place in the right time. So my perspective and what I've told the Australians and also the Brits is, if confirmed, or before, I think it should be the policy of the United States government to do everything we can to make this work. And again, as we talked about in your office, Senator, this is getting back to restoring our defense industrial capacity so that we don't have to face these awful choices, but rather can be in a position where we can produce not only for ourselves, but for our allies.
Having more capacity, even if it's a joint capacity, is a good thing. We just have to be careful as we try to produce an Australian capacity that we don't end up in a time period where we're sort of less than we would otherwise be.
Precisely, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to you, Mr. Colby, and I want to welcome your family as well. Thank you for joining us today. I do appreciate your ongoing service and commitment to our Department of Defense. So for years, I've been calling out the waste, fraud, and abuse that we have had at the Pentagon to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are used to support our war fighters and protecting our nation. And the Department of Defense, which controls the largest portion of our discretionary budget in the federal government, has never once passed a full financial audit. The failure erodes public trust and prevents efficient use of taxpayer dollars for critical defense priorities. So, Mr. Colby, what policies will you put into place to ensure that the DoD passes an audit, as the law requires, by 2028?
Well, Senator, thank you very much, and thanks for your kind words for my family as well as the other senators. I absolutely would regard it as a priority, if confirmed, to make sure that the policies are in place to encourage efficiency and compliance with the federal audit. I agree with you, Senator. I mean, for the amount of money that we're spending, we should be getting better results. And I'm confident, and of course, your leadership in the Doge Caucus and so forth, this is a real potential where we could get much better results and have a better defense industrial base kind of situation, better readiness for our forces. So I would certainly commit. I don't have a specific recommendation at this point, but I most welcome hearing your thoughts and your team's thoughts about how to do that.
Well, thank you. And I truly look forward to working with you on that issue as well. Let's go to the Middle East. I know there has been a lot of discussion already this morning about the Middle East and Central Command. The signing of the Abraham Accords during the first Trump administration, significant achievement. It was monumental. It was a strategic breakthrough for the region. I've worked to expand this agreement through legislation in previous defense bills. We focused on enhanced integration with our partners, which could be the examples that we've had: air and missile defense, artificial intelligence capabilities, and maritime cooperation to counter Iran. So what are your thoughts in expanding the Abraham Accords? How can we accomplish that?
Well, thanks, Senator. I think the Abraham Accords were a triumph of President Trump's first term, and I'm very hopeful that they can be built on in this term. I think they're an example of where diplomacy that isn't expected and maybe kind of unorthodox in certain ways can nonetheless come about. And I think it offers part of the solution to dealing with Iran's regional hegemonic aspirations, its use of proxies and so forth, although it's not exclusively so. But I think, if confirmed from a defense point of view, this is an area where there's a lot that can be done to build up the capabilities of those like the Emiratis, the Saudis with their reforms, obviously consistent with Israel's qualitative military edge and so forth. But I'm a really big fan of the Abraham Accords and the model. And if confirmed, I'd put a lot of sort of shoulder into it.
Wonderful. And you mentioned the Emiratis, but also the Saudis as well. So thoughts on normalization, how we could assist with that with the kingdom? Well,
Senator, I'm not fully briefed on exactly where things are. I think the more we can promote and encourage normalization, I assume you mean between Riyadh and Jerusalem, I think that would be that would be a huge coup. I've seen reporting on that. In the press, I don't know where things stand. Again, that's an area where quiet diplomacy probably makes is probably the most effective. But I think that would be an incredible thing. And if I were confirmed, I would certainly I would support that efforts in that direction.
I do too. I think that would lend to additional stability across the Middle East by the addition of that normalization between Jerusalem and Riyadh. So as we discussed during our in-office meeting, I've been working a very long time to combat sexual assault in our military. Secretary Hegseth committed to appointing a senior official to ensure a focus on sexual assault prevention within the Department of Defense. So, Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you work with me on this appointment to ensure focused leadership on this critical issue? And will you commit to providing Congress with regular updates on the progress made in this area?
I will, Senator.
Okay. I appreciate just being straightforward on that. Thank you. So again, just in remaining time, and I know my dear friend from Alaska will talk a little more about NATO, but talking about how relationships matter around the globe, just in the remaining time, just give me your stance on America remain engaged on the world stage.
Yes, Senator, I think America should remain engaged on the world stage, and a lot of what I'm trying to argue for is a way to do that, and I think is sustainable with the threats that we face and the national resources we have and our long-term interests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colby. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Colby, I think I'm going to ask you to enlarge on that on the record. So at this point, I think that'd be helpful. Senator King, Senator Warren beat you here. So she gets to go first. Senator Warren. No, Senator. Okay. Senator King.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, the Vice President characterized you as a truth teller, someone who would tell the truth to power. And yet today you've not told truth of who started the war in Ukraine. I'll give you one more chance. Who started the war in Ukraine?
Well, Senator, I would tell the truth. I don't think I'm saying anything that's untrue, but I also think it's important to be discreet and say things at the appropriate time and place.
The problem is you tell us you're going to tell truth to power. The most obvious truth is that Russia invaded Ukraine. Everybody in the world knows that. And you won't say it here today because it appears that you don't want to offend the president. But that's the whole point of the vice president's testimony, that you would say truth to power, but you won't do it here today on the record. This is an obvious truth. Reminds me of the old country song, who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes? We all saw